On that theme of catastrophe and avoiding it, the threat of nuclear war is really growing. This is in large part due to the terrifying escalation of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. We've obviously seen hundreds of billions of dollars sent to Ukraine in military aid. There's a clamour within NATO for even more direct confrontation with Russia, and including providing Ukraine with long-range missiles to hit Russia. How did we get here? Is there a path to peace? What is the alternative towards this escalation towards basically a possible third world war?
Yes. So it's not rocket science at all about how to deal with this. This is basically like the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. And when you do diplomacy, it's like having a human relationship. You need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the person, whether it's an ally or an adversary. You have to be able to see their side as well in order to find the common ground. And so it's important, for people to remember, we've been here. We've been here when Russia moved missiles to Cuba, and we basically had the nuclear weapons in the airplanes launched. We were very touchy about our borders, and we still are very touchy about our borders. We basically created the Monroe Doctrine, which still exists, that says no other country may come to our hemisphere, let alone on our borders. And that's basically the position that Russia has taken. We promised Gorbachev back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we made the promise that when Germany was allowed to reunify, which has always been a threat to Russia, Russia's been invaded several times by a unified Germany. We promised Russia, and NATO promised Russia, the West promised Russia, but especially James Baker under George Bush promised Russia we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east of Germany. So that promise was violated for the first time in the mid-1990s, just a couple of years after it was made. And Russia kind of went ballistic, saying, no, you can't do this. And virtually all well-informed experts on Eastern Europe and Russia absolutely knew that this would be a disaster, that Russia will, if pushed, go to the mat. This is an existential threat to Russia's existence, just like having Russian missiles on our border in Cuba was an existential threat to us. And the long predicted has happened, and Russia has offered innumerable opportunities to negotiate, specifically on the one demand that Ukraine remain neutral, neutrality for Ukraine, so that there would not be nuclear weapons within minutes of a striking distance against Moscow. Not an unreasonable demand for neutrality. That's what Austria did following the Second World War. Austria maintained neutrality. That's perfectly workable. But unfortunately, with the warmongers in US office, we basically had a continuing march to the east. And then the US participated in a coup against the democratically elected ruler of Ukraine, who had taken a position of neutrality. And the US, together with Victoria Nuland, whose phone conversation was famously leaked as she was planning who the new ruling parties would be, who the new rulers effectively would be. The US assisted in that very violent coup. You had John McCain and Victoria Nuland out there in the Maidan handing out cookies to support what became a very violent and bloody protest, which led to the coup and basically drove out Yanukovych. So that was really the beginning of active hostilities and suppression of the Russian-speaking population, largely in the eastern provinces, and a number of consequent events, the threats that Ukraine would take over Crimea and Russia's only warm water port, which again was an existential threat. So it's unfortunate, but Russia wasn't going to allow that to happen. That was perfectly clear. And there was also a referendum in Crimea, which was largely populated by Russian speakers who wanted to be annexed by Russia. And same thing from the eastern provinces that were long asking Russia, can we please become part of the Russian Federation? And Russia, for a long time, was saying, no, you need to be independent. Let's abide by the Minsk Accords. But others did not abide by the Minsk Accords. And the hostilities were ongoing. Thousands upon thousands of people in the eastern provinces, Russian speakers, were killed by this very aggressive policy that was taken by Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, against Russian speakers. So there were hostilities hostilities going on here, very active hostilities, certainly since 2014. And regrettably, Russia invaded, which is a violation of international law. You're not allowed to do that. It was a criminal and brutal act, and that war is horrific and absolutely brutal. But the US has basically given thumbs up and pours gasoline on those fires continuously. And instead of supporting a ceasefire or a negotiated solution, the US has been on the other side, basically whipping up the conflict, pouring money into it, and also disrupting a peace treaty that actually was created under the auspices of Turkey, a peace agreement where Russia was actually very willing to compromise on a number of really critical fronts. And the US and the UK actually disrupted that and told Ukraine in no uncertain terms that they were not allowed to seek peace here. So this is devastating. It's absolutely devastating to the people of Ukraine who've been sustaining an absolutely huge jaw-dropping burden on Ukraine. You know, according to our Secretary of Defense, we were going to be fighting this war basically to bleed Russia, not because we thought we could win, but because we could essentially draw down on Russia's resources. So this is like a war being fought to the last Ukrainian for the benefit of a very aggressive US policy that doesn't benefit the stability of the world, doesn't benefit the people of the US. What exactly are our interests here, except delivering more contracts to the war profiteers who are in the business of calling the shots in Congress? And this is an absolute betrayal of the interests of the American people.